Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. In America, one can watch sporting events 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on television. This media saturation gives athletes and coaches an outsized presence on our TVs and in our living rooms. Many use this opportunity to share their religion or their faith with an almost evangelical zeal. My guest today, Stefanie Heinrich, is researching and writing about athletes, sports, and religion in America, and has some intriguing insights to share about sports media evangelism. Welcome, Stefanie. It's great to have you here. I just want to share something first before we start, and then I'll have you introduce yourself. But we work at the same university, but we didn't meet each other until we were in a conference together giving papers that had some interesting overlaps. So
yeah, that's true.
It's I guess that's the way the modern university is. But just introduce yourself and what you're doing here and how you got interested in this topic about sports and faith.
Sure. As you said, Stefanie Heinrich, and I'm a doctoral candidate in educational studies at the University of Oklahoma. But I'm currently here at Appalachian State as the director of graduate student life, so looking after our grad students and helping them through their educational journeys here at Appalachian. But while I was at the University of Oklahoma working on my PhD, I worked for the Department of Athletics there for many years, through my master's and well into my doctoral program. And I was an avid college football fan, sooner born, sooner bred, as we say in Oklahoma, and getting to kind of peek behind the curtain and work with our athletes and our athletic department staff day in and day out was really eye-opening. And I decided to kind of incorporate an actual emphasis on sport into my PhD work. But my undergrad studies, I double majored. One of my majors was in religious studies. And so I always had an interest in studying contemporary religion and religion and life in the U.S. And I just kind of started to observe some things through this athletic space and started to observe some of my athletes' religious lives as well, and how it was kind of tying into their sporting lives. And I got really fascinated on that, and it just kind of, as things do, just kind of opened a can of worms for me.
Yeah, well, you're really pulling all your academic interests together in this dissertation.
Exactly, right? Yes.
And it fits very well with some of my interests as well.
Yeah.
I'm coming at it from a different perspective, coming at it from religious studies with an interest in sports, but it's really fascinating how these things come together.
Yep.
Now, I think, as fans, we're used to seeing athletes pray, acknowledge God in speech and in action. Is there something about sports and faith that kind of feed off of one another?
Yes.
It seems like it's omnipresent in the sporting world.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a really natural relationship, particularly when we're talking about elite sports. And so there's this understanding that if you have a drive to become a collegiate athlete or professional athlete, an Olympic athlete, it takes a level of dedication. And I think even into itself a level of faith in the process. You wind up having to really put all of your eggs in one basket and then hyper focus in on your sport, right? To dedicate all of your time to become the top percentile. And so I think that dedication and that focus on your sport plays really well with people who have a strong religious faith as well, right? And so they just kind of go hand in hand. And you do see a lot of religious athletes who talk about their faith getting them through the difficult times in their sport, right? They're combating losses, they're combating injury, and having that faith tradition to rely on to get them through those moments is a common thread you see through these athletes as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
The kind of personal characteristics kind of go hand in hand there. Now, your research, I think at least part of it in particular, is focused on certain aspects of sport as evangelism, particularly media evangelism.
Sure.
And I thought one of the insights that I found very original in your work is that in some ways, the media evangelism in America, mid-century and all, paved the way for introducing faith through these media outlets, television, radio, and so forth. So I have a couple of images here of popular media evangelists. One that everyone will recognize is Billy Graham, and I guess he really is one who pioneered the use of television to reach mass audiences, right? And then the second one here, more contemporary, Joel Osteen, who is a very adept at using television to reach mass audiences. So can you say a little bit about this kind of moment in American religious history in the 20th century where these folks, these evangelists, found a way to reach more and more people?
I think that we're seeing certain denominations more so than others, but I think a lot of Christian denominations saw the turn and the growth of mass media as an opportunity to spread the word, right? And particularly in evangelical Christianity, that's a major theological drive there. It's not just you as an individual accepting Christ and being saved, but it's also spreading the word. And that is kind of a part and parcel purpose of that theological tradition. And so you had folks who, instead of looking at mass media as a detriment or a way to spread debauchery and things like this. Instead, it was a tool to be harnessed, and this was an opportunity to shift gears. And through this period, and we're still steadily seeing this, as we have such lower actual brick and mortar church attendance, right? But through television, through the radio, you still had the opportunity to meet people where they were at. And so it was that drive to say, at any given moment, you may have this mass audience, but you could reach one person. Even if you never see them, you never meet them. And so I think that was the driving kind of idea between televangelism.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned this notion that evangelicals might be put off by TV because of its association with popular, well, you used the word debauchery, but this kind of cult of celebrity that goes along with TV. And that has been the undoing of some television evangelists, right? So I guess it does cut both ways. Billy Graham famously was aware of the risk and took great pains to avoid some of those pitfalls.
Absolutely. And I was reading a book recently that did talk about how many folks who do study televangelism, they fall kind of into the trap of always equating televangelists with, say, the conservative right politically, or that conservative evangelical political aspect. But Billy Graham himself was very adamant on kind of keeping politics out of his televangelism and his preaching. It was very focused on again spreading the word and that very true to faith kind of televangelism. And so I do think it's really important in this conversation that we're not falling into kind of the tropes, right? That we're allowing some honesty here of what televangelism, is, and what it can be, and the negatives to it, of course. But it's too easy to kind of say all televangelists are.
Yeah, well, to avoid going down that rabbit hole, let's get back to sports. Football in particular, which I think I speak football better than other sports, and I think you focus on it some. The next picture I have here is of a couple of legendary coaches, and Billy Graham, I think you can maybe correct me here, but to paraphrase, he once said that a coach can have more impact on a person's life in a year than an average person can have in a lifetime. Something that, these are two of my favorite coaches. It tells you something about my age. But Vince Lombardi on the left of the Green Bay Packers and Tom Landry on the right of Dallas Cowboys, both staunch Christians, and used their I guess religion and faith, or weren't bashful about talking about their faith as a coach, right? Lombardi was a Catholic, and even at one point thought he would be a priest.
Yeah.
And Staubach was his quarterback. Landry and Staubach was a staunch Christian as well, Roger Staubach. Say something about coaches and the influence that they have, and maybe the way that some contemporary coaches are leveraging their celebrity or their power, I would say, in their relationship with players and the media.
Yeah, absolutely. Coach Landry, of course, being from Oklahoma, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. That's
Right.
the closest professional. So this is very much an image that I'm used to seeing. You have coaches, both from this era, of course, but now to today, who there's, particularly in college sports, we see it a bit more, but I think it bleeds well into professional as well, of the coach as minister, but also the coach in a paternalistic kind of role as well. And so we see a little bit in like college football recruiting, especially, of coaches as they're recruiting players, really kind of actually spending a lot of time with coaches or with players' parents as well. Kind of entrust your child to me. I'm going to make him a good man. I'm going to keep him safe. I'm going to put a good work ethic into him, make sure his behavior is right, all of that kind of attitudes. And I think that we have a fair number of coaches who do kind of leverage their religious backgrounds and their staunch religious faith on that as well. Being a good Christian and a good Christian faith and kind of all the things that we culturally kind of assign to that idea. We kind of hope that, and I say that we broadly, hope that then coaches are kind of instilling those strong values into their players is kind of the cultural idea there.
And some would see that as a requirement of their faith, right? So,
Yes.
So I don't want to be cynical about using a kind of power dynamic
Sure.
and using religion to affect something in their players, but I would say most coaches are very devout, or at least coaches who are devout are sincere, right? And they're wanting to impart certain values to their players and be that kind of paternalistic figure.
Absolutely. And I think that from their perspective, that's a good thing. I think there's definitely cause for concern in that those values may not be the same type of values that a different family or a different person puts a lot of emphasis on, or thinks should be upheld, particularly if it's coming through the connection to a strong Christian faith, right? And so when we look at even, say, a college football team, we could have over 100 players on it. There's no guarantee that all 100 of those players are also Christian. Right.
Probably a guarantee that not all 100 are Christian, right? Right. So in that case, you have the danger of someone using their power and their influence to shape someone in a way that they would not otherwise be shaped, right?
Absolutely.
Well, since you mentioned college athletics, the next picture, again, of a coach who will be well known in the contemporary setting is Dabo Swinney.
Yes, absolutely.
Of Clemson, very strong evangelical Christian.
Yes.
Here seen praying on the sidelines, right? And I think I've seen other images where he's praying with his team.
Yes.
And he's pretty upfront about the role that faith and religion plays and what he's doing at Clemson. So maybe you could say something about Dabo, just since we've got him here on the screen.
Oh, Dabo.
Yeah.
I think that currently he's kind of one because of Clemson's football notoriety, and generally most years a winning program, right? Not doing so great this year, but generally. So that puts him on a very visible pedestal, right? And through that, he is not at all whatsoever shy about talking about his own personal faith and how he very actively infuses his Christian and his particular Christian faith back into Clemson football, right? He has a quote from here recently with the influx of conversations about name, image, and likeness. This is a new ruling that allows athletes to profit off of their own name, image, and likeness, which up until a few years ago was completely unallowed, right? And when asked about NIL, Dabo said that actually he built Clemson football on NIL, but not the way that we would think, in that he built it on God's name, image, and likeness.
Wow.
And that his faith in God was the foundation of what he had built at Clemson, right? And there's well-known and videos of players being baptized on the Clemson football field. And so it is seeped so visibly and viscerally into Clemson football as to be fascinating.
It is fascinating. And yeah, I'll ask a more general question, not about Dabo, because we don't know what's in his mind. But
of course.
Do you think? I guess these coaches realize that there could be a conflict between the type of coaches in a very powerful position.
Sure.
Maybe much like a military drill sergeant or something, right? Particularly one who has a strong disciplinary culture.
Absolutely.
Right. So are they aware that the powerful position they're in might place undue pressure on a student athlete to act, behave, or profess belief in a certain way?
I can't imagine that they're not aware. I do make the argument in some of my work that particularly Christianity and a fairly conservative bend of Christianity does get kind of a free pass in athletic departments because it does have a quote-unquote positive impact on athlete behavior. It controls athlete behavior in a way that is useful to the athletic department and to the football team, right? And so whether or not the coaches are doing that in a truly active way, I can't speak to, right? Until they say it themselves.
Yeah.
But through various court cases, particularly at the K through 12 level, we don't see a lot of concerns being raised about the separation of church and state in college and in college sports in ways that I think is interesting. And I think there's something about them being adults that kind of plays into that. But we see language in the K through 12 level of educational spaces and sports having a subtle coercive nature just by the inherent power structures between coaches, teachers, and students that I do think is still very much active in college sports.
Well, you raised an interesting point about First Amendment concerns. And there's something about college and adults that maybe they get up. But if I were to walk into my classroom with an active audience, a passive audience there, and start my class with prayer, I'd be wrapped on the knuckles big time, right? Because of the First Amendment. But here, the football field is a classroom for these young men, right?
Yes.
So there is a dynamic there that I wouldn't say universities get a pass, but college athletics get a pass, right? So in a way that other academic spaces do not.
Very much so. So prior to the 1960s, and I'll keep it brief, but prior to the 1960s, most universities operated under what we called in loco parentis, or in place of the parent. And so universities had basically the wherewithal to create any rules and any disciplining force that a parent had. So parents entrusted their children to the universities. And this is prior to lowering the voting age to 18. This is prior to, again, a lot of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement through the 60s. Coming out of the 60s, it switched to what's kind of casually called sine parentibus, so without parents. So now we look at college students as adults, right? Yeah. With their own kind of wherewithal. There is strong arguments through some aspects of research on college sports that argue that athletic departments are set aside from the rest of the institution, the higher education institution, and that athletic departments themselves are still operating in loco parentis.
Okay.
And so we kind of don't have the same kind of control over athletic departments because they have control over themselves, which in a way allows ultimately this lack of concern about separated church and state in that space.
Well, let's get to the fun part, the athletes themselves, right?
Okay.
The founder of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Don McClannon, famously said, if athletes can endorse shaving cream, razor blades, and cigarettes, that dates it a little bit, right? Surely they can endorse the Lord too.
Absolutely.
So we're used to seeing athletes on commercials hawking everything.
Yep.
But we also are used to seeing athletes use their bodies almost as billboards to communicate faith. So I've got a picture of some of my favorite athletes, Tim Tebow, and this was when he was at Florida, I think, and he was well known for using patches under his eyes that many athletes use, but his always had Bible verses on them, right? Yep. And then next picture is, I think, Tebow as a pro athlete who was famous for, I think they called this Tebowing, right?
Tebowing, yeah.
So before taking a knee was done in protest, Tim Tebow would kneel in the end zone to celebrate touchdowns.
Absolutely.
So very public display of his faith.
Yes.
And he talked a lot about his faith. Let's see who else we have up here. Next picture, I think, is, and I apologize for focusing on football.
No,
but
it's easy, right? Yeah.
Derrick Henry.
Yeah.
All right. And some of his teammates and other athletes use the opportunity of putting the eye paint on in the shape of a cross.
Yes.
And it's a clear projection of his faith. He's a very strong Christian.
Yep.
I think he began his Heisman Trophy acceptance speech thanking God or something, and we're used to hearing that.
Yep.
A couple more pictures, and I want to let you talk about them. And then the next picture is Tua Tagovailoa. Practice pronouncing that name all day. Again, the cross under the eyes. So
yes.
Maybe comment on this kind of phenomenon of athletes using their bodies and their words in a very public way to express their faith.
Yeah. As you said, Don McClanahan from FCA, even in the 1950s, he recognized that we were a hero-worshiping nation, and recognized the power in harnessing the visibility of athletes, right? But athletes become visible through their physical prowess, right? That's ultimately what sport is, the type of sport anyways. And so we very much have Nike swooshes, and we have our Under Armour signs, and athletes, every time they step onto the field or the court, they're ultimately advertising for something. They're advertising for their team, their university, and whichever brand at least supports their actual uniforms and things like that. But they've also found ways to take their showmanship and their elite sporting bodies and advertise for their faith traditions as well. And it's easy to say, like, on one side we can say, well, that's obviously their prerogative, and this is something that's I always caution us to ever question what's in their own minds, and I certainly don't want to question anyone's personal and independent faith beliefs and their traditions. But we do have to think about the purpose sometimes behind such public displays of faith, particularly when we have ultimately scriptures in the Bible that would counteract and contradict some of their faith displays, right? And so you always kind of start to question of what purpose it may serve, right? Especially when you do have organizations like Fellowship of Christian Athletes who are just out and vocal talking about harnessing popular sports to spread the word, right? So.
Yeah, and you mentioned Don McClanahan recognizing the potential of the way we put our athletes on a pedestal, and I think you used the phrase hero worship. And it struck me as you said that both sports and religion are prone to encouraging fanaticism.
Yes.
We have fans, right?
Right.
Is that the hero worship part? I mean, why are you such a Cowboys fan? You know, what caught you? And I am too, by the way. Yeah. But why do we have this kind of sports fanaticism? Yeah. And is it the same as religious fanaticism?
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I've been thinking about that a little bit recently. there's really interesting spheres of research that you can kind of get to this answer a little bit when we look at kind of in-group and out-group sociology. There's always needs to be kind of an us versus them mentality for a lot of folks. And then when we look at the way sports brand themselves, when we look at sports branding, sports don't have a product to sell in the same way that, say, like Chevrolet has a product to sell, right? Sports is really, they need to kind of build these intergenerational lines of sports fanaticism so that you can go through and be a Cubs fan through decades and decades and decades of terrible Cubs football or baseball, excuse me, and you'll still be a Cubs fan, right? Same with, we don't ever want to be a fair weather fan. That's the worst thing to be. And yet we're seeing now, I think, the breakdown of some of that in particularly college sports with the way recruitment works and the way athletes are shifting teams, the transfer portal in a way that we've never seen before. And we're seeing fans be less tied to a regional team than we used to have. And we're seeing that, I think, in the same way with churches, actually. We're seeing individuals feel like they're less tied to the denominations that they grew up with.
Right.
They're less tied to physical churches. So I think we're actually in a shifting landscape now, too. I don't have answers to that. But
no, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that recently.
Yeah, because certainly one of the things and one of the demographic changes in American religiosity is this tendency to change denominations, and it's no longer the case that if you move somewhere, you look for the Methodist church, right? You look for a church that fits your needs.
Fits you, yeah.
Yeah, so that's really an interesting comment. I'd like to see where you end up
I'm not
with
sure.
that. Yeah, we'll see.
That rabbit hole.
Yeah. One last thing I want to. I could talk to you about this all day, right?
Sure.
But another thing that you are exploring in your dissertation is the use of language. And you've alluded to the phenomenon that the language of Christian evangelicalism and the language of sport overlap. Yeah. So let me take a stab because I haven't read but I would think of words like sacrifice, discipline, a phrase like higher purpose.
Yes.
Is this the type of language that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also less obvious, but it's there, language that focuses on individualism. So you see a little bit with when you hear athletes talk about it's very much on their individual work ethic, the sacrifice, like you said, that they made. It's so much of when we get up to that elite level of sports, it's 1 in 10, it's 1 in whatever, right? And so when we kind of combine that as well with kind of the evangelical faith tradition, which is very focused on the individual personal salvation, right? There's less of the work side of that, and it's more on the individual salvation and that theology. And so we kind of tie that there. There's also some interesting work showing relationships between like post game interviews and acceptance speeches with also like prosperity gospel language that's very similar, which I think is fascinating. There's only a few works that I've seen out there who have explicitly tied those together. But you do see that, and you do see what I think is interesting is particularly when we see it through televangelism, when we see it through evangelical Christianity, harnessing mass media, or these great big super churches or the mega churches, you see them talk about market focus, and you see them talk about mass production, and you see them talking about providing a goods and services to their flock, these kind of concepts. And so you kind of tie that back into within sports broadcasting and who they're meeting and market focus and things like that. So a very kind of capitalistic language as well that kind of ties the two together.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, if we had time, I'd like to talk about ritual, sacred space, sacred time next time.
Next time.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great.
We do this
and
all
good
day.
luck on your studies.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week on Religion and Life. I hope you'll join us next week here on App TV. as we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, and society. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.